So to help ideologically locate progressive education, I'm going to briefly walk through the changes between classical liberalism and modern liberalism so that we have an understanding of how the economy and this increasing reliance on science impacted the way people saw the world. So the first shift is in natural law. If you remember, the classical liberal idea of natural law is that there is this universal truth that's available and is just waiting to be uncovered by the human use of reason or intellect. Here, we see the influence of science and the rapid changes that have been taking place technologically and in broader society. Charles Darwin, in particular, had a huge influence on perception of natural law. So, people are moving away from this idea that the world is just this machine that's knowable and static, and instead are thinking in terms of evolution, in terms of rapid change, and also thinking in terms of change that is not necessarily guaranteed. It's a change that it has to be fought for, struggled for, in order to move forward. So Darwin, in that sense, has a profound influence on perceptions of a lot of different things. Whereas before, people had this confidence that things would just kind of get better as the future came. Um, Now they're thinking, well, it's not necessarily guaranteed. This is something that we have to fight for. So social Darwinism, in this perspective, really had a huge influence. So scientific rationality also has a big influence, and this is a move again away from faith and reason. It's an extension in the sense that people still have a strong faith in intellect and intellectual activity, but it's a very narrowed version of that intellectual activity, and people are often applying it to economic arenas. So there's this idea, for example, Taylorization, that if you use a scientific approach, you can increase productivity and efficiency in factories. So if you just speed up the belt a little bit or something like that, you can make things a lot faster. So again, you see the connection between scientific rationality and natural law in the sense that scientific rationality is not assuming that there's this one unchanging truth that's available. It's saying, based on the information I have at the moment, this is what I believe to be true. But I acknowledge that this could change and that this is a process. It's not necessarily a static entity. The other thing about scientific rationality and this idea that I can control the nature of knowledge by controlling the process through which I've obtained and validated that knowledge is that science is used to make knowledge appear neutral, objective, or fair. So experiential knowledge, in contrast, it's obvious that that is subjective, that it is influenced by human perceptions, decision making, and so forth. Whereas scientific knowledge quite often is able to masquerade as something that is untouched by human bias or human subjectivity. Obviously, that's not true. Even at a very basic level, what question the scientist chooses to pursue is a subjective choice. And then all the way through that process, there are choices, there are decisions, there are things that are not known, that are only guessed at, things that are avoided that should have been included. It's not an objective process. However, this label of science or rationality quite often makes it appear as if it is universal, decontextualized, untouched. And that adds authority to the kind of knowledge that can hide under that framework. And that becomes very important because obviously there's a lot of power in being able to pretend that your knowledge is not subjective, that it's just the way things are or just the truth. And then the last kind of tie-in with this is rational ethics. So rather than a more spiritual-based form of morality, and one that is more consistent and lasts over time, rational ethics is starting to say, well, you make the best decision you can in that moment with the information that you have at hand. However, that may change. So in that sense, you're not using your religion or something like that to tell you what's right and wrong. You're using your intellectual judgment or your reason to decide. So then the other three and how that changes. Progress we already kind of talked about, just this idea that it's not guaranteed that things are going to get better, but through that scientific rationality, through that management, you can keep striving for it and keep expanding. The other part of progress that relates back to that social Darwinism is this idea that if you are not survival of the fittest, if you are someone who is not a good competitor, then you may impede progress. You may be considered a danger to progress, and therefore it should be marginalized in order to help everybody else move forward. So when you consider the gendered or the racial or classed implications of that, or the implications of something like for children with special needs, for example, you can see that this is a real rationale for exclusion and inequality, but it makes it appear, again, like it's natural or neutral. So another big aspect of modern liberalism that is very prominent during the progressive era is nationalism. There are huge pressures for Americanization and really overt forms of patriotism. In 1890 up until the 1920s, there was one of the most widespread waves of immigration in U.S. history. And a lot of people, what they call like the native citizens, they didn't really know what to do with all of this complexity, all these new people. And there was a huge kind of backlash, this idea that we need people to learn how to speak English, we need to accommodate them into the American lifestyle and so forth. So schools, again, were asked to take on this Americanizing process. So if you watch that video, As American as Public School, that gives you a really good overview of this phenomenon. So freedom, then, is another aspect of modern and classical liberalism. But in modern liberalism, it looks a little different. One of the things we see is we're moving away from the idea that everyone has intellectual capacity, everyone has a right to self-govern, and that's what makes you free. That the lack of interference is part of what makes you free. Instead, with this kind of freedom, what we're seeing is this reformer belief that you have a right to intervene. So it's they call it positive freedom. And what that means is that it's the government or the reformer right to intervene in someone else's life and fix problems that are perceived so that you're creating the conditions for optimal freedom. The other part of freedom in this time period is deregulation, is really what it is. And what that means is that there's very little oversight or control over mega corporations or the business world. So one of the things we see is a huge rise in capitalism, a stronger emphasis on market competition, and this idea that that's what makes the nation strong and that's what makes us free. Now, along with all of this, we see the scientific influence in a lot of different ways. This is a time period where we're seeing all these new different kinds of academic disciplines, all these areas of study. The literature that's out there, the research that's out there is increasingly widespread and complex. So there's a lot of new knowledge being generated in a lot of different ways. One of the disciplines that's really coming into its own at this time is psychology. And so educators and people who are policymakers related to schools, they're looking to this discipline as a sort of guidepost for more effective ways of teaching and more effective ways of working with children. We saw early little hints of this with Horace Mann, where he's saying, don't use physical punishment, use the emotion of the child to kind of manipulate them to get them what you want, to do what you want them to. Now with this new psychology, one of the things we're seeing is that for the first time, they're taking into account the non-rational motivations for behavior. It's not just that people are like machines where they're pure intellect, but now we're understanding that there's actually other parts to human experience, to learning, and teachers are very much encouraged to consider these ideas as part of their overall practice. Now, that's not to say, however, that outside the school, there still isn't that heavy emphasis on an economic model rather than the emotion or the experience of children. So one of the big struggles that really comes into its own, and it's still with us today, is this tension between what educators know is the best for children as learners and as human beings, and what outside policymakers want schools to do based on political or economic agendas. So from this standpoint, one of the things we can see is, just like with the common school, the progressive era has a lot of corporate influence. There's a lot of ways in which models of industry are applied to schools, and there's a lot of overlap between how students are treated and trained and how workers are treated out in the workforce. There's also a lot of overlap in terms of people who are industrialists telling the schools we need this, 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 and this to happen with students so that we have a strong economy as a nation. So that's where Charles Eliot basically fits in. The idea that if somebody has to take out the garbage, not everybody can be a lawyer, and so what we need to do is track people and train them for all these different jobs that are out in this increasingly complicated economy, and that way our economy, all these little cogs in the machine of our economy, will continue to move forward. It doesn't necessarily matter theoretically who takes out the garbage and who doesn't, but the way this played out, it definitely overlapped with existing inequalities around socioeconomic status, around gender, and around race. So the people who ended up taking the garbage, it was really no surprise based on the different ways in which they were located politically, economically, and socially. So that's one big corporate influence on the schools, is the idea of tracking and better fitting students for the future economy. We also see that in terms of running schools itself, it was very managerial. It's becoming very business oriented. We can see that so much more today, but this is kind of the starting point of that logic that we very much live with today. So if we look at one of these quotes here, we can see that a lot of administrators during this time period, they weren't necessarily focusing on content or learning experience. They were focusing on management. They were focusing on the administration of the building and the administration of the system. Now, that's kind of a big switch, and it really demonstrates the influence of outside priorities on what happens in schools. Because theoretically, it would be better if we had administrators who could focus on the knowledge, on the meaning of what's happening inside the building, not just on keeping the machine moving forward. And then lastly, one of the things we're seeing is that part of this ideology that's taking place through all the different components of modern liberalism is intended to convince people who are being exploited or marginalized by the system that this is a fair system, that this is okay and it's legitimate, and you end up where you end up based on what you deserve and how hard you've worked. So a different word for that is meritocracy. The idea that you rise or fall based on your own merit, but that the system itself is completely fair, open, and neutral. Even a brief understanding of these historical moments would say that's completely not true, that it's fair and open. But the belief that it is an important social stabilizer. So if I'm poor and I am very marginalized and I'm having a really hard time in my life, if you can convince me that that's my fault, that I just need to work harder, or I need another degree, or something like that, I will only be mad at myself. I will not want some sort of social overthrow or economic rearranging. I will simply want an opportunity to individually improve my condition and leave the system in place. So meritocracy in that point provides a huge social stabilizing effect on what at this time period and today as well is really a tremendously unequal system. The other thing that meritocracy does is it validates people who are the elites, who are benefiting from this exploitation. It's saying you must be rich because you worked harder, because you deserve it, not because you exploited your workers or didn't pay them a living wage or had government subsidies or broke the law. So meritocracy and this idea that if you can convince people at the bottom to buy into this, you're better off as an elite. Well, that becomes very important to understand. There's another PowerPoint that's going to be available in week 2 that explores this idea in more depth. But for now, with the progressive era, just know that meritocracy is part of this broader conversation, and in particular, it is connected to scientific rationality.